On August 8, 2000, Susan Carter and her 10-year-old daughter, Natasha Alex Carter, vanished from their home in Beckley, West Virginia. Susan had just picked up her daughter from school. They were supposed to spend the evening together like any other ordinary day. But when night came, neither of them was seen again. Police suspected Larry Webb, Susan's estranged husband. He claimed the two had left voluntarily. He said they were fine. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into years, no one heard from Susan or Alex again. No phone calls, no bank records, no sightings that held up. It was as if a mother and her daughter had been erased in broad daylight. For more than 2 decades, investigators searched for answers. Family members begged for the truth. The case grew cold, leaving nothing but questions and suspicion. Then, in April 2024, everything changed. On his deathbed, Larry Webb confessed. He admitted killing Susan and Alex on that August day and burying their bodies in his backyard. Hours later, police recovered their remains, ending a 24-year mystery in one of West Virginia's most haunting cold cases. The shocking revelation left a single question echoing. Why did it take a deathbed confession to finally bring Susan and Alex home? If this case moved you, don't forget to like this video and share it so more people can hear Susan and Alex's story. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next case we uncover together. And let me know in the comments, what do you think really happened? And what lessons should we take from this tragedy? Susan Carter was 41 years old when she disappeared. She lived in Beckley, West Virginia, a town where people knew one another, and neighbors noticed when something was out of place. Susan was described as a hardworking mother who cared deeply for her daughter. She had gone through a divorce but was determined to raise her child in as stable an environment as possible. Her daughter, Natasha Carter, known to everyone as Alex, was only 10 years old. At that age, she was full of energy and curiosity. Teachers remembered her as smart and lively. Friends said she was close to her mother, often seen walking hand in hand with Susan in their neighborhood. Alex had no history of trouble at school or in the community. She was a child who should have had a safe and ordinary life. The date, August 8, 2000, became the day everything changed. On that morning, Susan and Alex were simply another mother and daughter in Beckley. By nightfall, they were gone. Susan was a single mother. She shared custody of Alex with her ex-husband, Rick Lafferty. Alex spent most of her time with Susan but still visited her father. Those who knew the family say Rick cared deeply about his daughter, but after the divorce, Alex lived primarily with her mother. At the time of the disappearance, Susan and Alex were living with Susan's boyfriend, Larry Webb. He was older, and their relationship was far from stable. Neighbors often overheard arguments between the two. The disputes were mostly about money, bills, expenses, and Susan's frustration with how Webb handled household responsibilities. It wasn't unusual for voices to be raised in the Carter-Webb household. Despite the tension, no one expected violence of the scale that was about to unfold. Susan had no history of running away. She had no reason to abandon her life in Beckley. She was known as reliable, dependable, and focused on raising Alex. Alex was a child who loved her home, her school. Neighbors remembered seeing them regularly. Susan was often out with Alex, whether running errands or simply walking around their community. They were familiar faces, a mother and daughter whose presence was part of the neighborhood's daily rhythm. On the surface, they looked like a family managing the struggles of everyday life. But underneath, there was conflict. Larry Webb, the man Susan lived with, would later admit in fragments and in anger that their arguments had escalated. By the time investigators pieced together their story, witnesses recalled Webb shouting at Susan. Some remembered Susan confiding in them that she was unhappy. Money was a constant issue. The family home, once meant to be a place of safety for her and Alex, had become a place of tension. Still, none of that explained how both Susan and Alex could vanish without a trace on a single summer day. What made the case unforgettable was the contrast between who they were and what happened to them. Susan and Alex were ordinary in the best sense of the word. Neighbors you trusted, classmates you waved to at school, a mother who worked hard and a daughter who loved her. When their absence stretched beyond a few hours, and then a few days, alarm turned to panic. Friends asked how it was possible for two people to vanish so completely. Susan's ex-husband Rick asked himself how he could explain to anyone that his daughter, who had spent the weekend with him just days earlier, had suddenly disappeared. The mystery wasn't just about what happened on August 8th. It was about who Susan and Alex were in their community. They were not the kind of people who disappeared. Law enforcement knew immediately that this wasn't a case of voluntary departure. They had to consider foul play. And the last person known to be with Susan and Alex was Larry Webb. That detail would shape the entire trajectory of the investigation. For years, Webb remained at the center of suspicion. But in the first days and weeks, and then, suddenly, silence. The day of their disappearance, Susan did not show up anywhere she was expected. Alex did not return to school. There were no phone calls, no sightings, no messages. For a mother and daughter so rooted in their routines, this absence was unexplainable. Community members remembered the sudden change. Posters went up across Beckley. Vigils were held. People gathered in churches, praying for their safe return. The names Susan and Alex Carter became synonymous with the question no one could answer. Where did they go? As weeks turned into months, the story of Susan and Alex was retold again and again. It wasn't only about their disappearance. It was about the image of a mother holding her daughter's hand on a quiet street in West Virginia. A simple moment that everyone thought would last forever. Their introduction to the public became part of the case itself. Every news broadcast described them. Susan, the devoted mother. Alex, the energetic 10-year-old. Both of them gone without explanation. For law enforcement, those details mattered because they helped rule out possibilities. Susan had no history of disappearing. Alex had no reason to leave. This wasn't a case of people who wanted to vanish. This was something else, something darker. Neighbors later told reporters that the absence of Susan and Alex left a hole in the community. For years, their names were spoken with a mix of hope and grief. People wanted to believe they were still alive, but the lack of answers made that hope fade. In time, what stood out most was how ordinary their lives had been. That ordinariness made the crime feel even more shocking. There was nothing about Susan or Alex that explained their fate. They were simply a mother and daughter living their lives, until one day they were gone. And that is the sharp contrast at the heart of this case. On the outside, they looked like a normal family in a quiet town. In reality, it was the morning of August 8th, 2000, in Beckley, West Virginia. A quiet weekday in a small town where nothing seemed unusual. Susan Carter, 41, and her 10-year-old daughter, Natasha, Alex Carter, were going about their lives as they always did. They were known faces in the community, and that day began like any other. There were no warnings, no signs they were preparing to leave, no indication that the lives of both mother and daughter were about to be cut short. Friends and neighbors recalled seeing them around town that morning. Alex had recently returned from visiting her father, Rick Lafferty, and was preparing for the school year. Susan was handling her usual household routine. There was nothing that suggested either of them had plans to disappear. For those who knew them, everything looked normal, ordinary, steady. The last confirmed sighting came that same day. Susan and Alex were at the Beckley home where they had been living with Susan's boyfriend, Larry Webb. Webb had been part of their lives for some time, though the relationship was described as rocky, often tense. By the afternoon of August 8th, no one outside that house would ever see Susan and Alex again. From that day forward, they vanished. Not just from their home, not just from Beckley. They disappeared completely. No phone calls to relatives, no messages to friends, no financial activity. Susan never showed up for work again. Alex never returned to school. For a mother and daughter so deeply tied to their daily routines, the silence was immediate and alarming. At first, confusion set in. Susan's family tried to reach her by phone, but the calls went unanswered. They thought maybe she had taken Alex away for a few days to clear her head. But days turned into weeks. There was no contact. There was no word. That absence quickly shifted from concern to outright fear. Rick Lafferty, Alex's father, was. Police opened a missing persons investigation. They reviewed the last known location of Susan and Alex, the house of Larry Webb. Webb told investigators that Susan and Alex had left suddenly. According to him, they packed their things and walked out the door, without giving him a reason, without saying goodbye. He claimed he had no idea where they went. He portrayed himself as confused, left behind, abandoned. But almost immediately his story raised doubts. Susan had left no word with her family. She hadn't taken clothing, money, or documents. Alex's school supplies remained untouched. Their personal belongings were still in the house. It was inconsistent with the idea that they had chosen to walk away voluntarily. Even more troubling, no neighbor saw them leave. No driver on the street recalled watching them pack or drive off. And no camera, no gas station clerk, no toll booth operator ever came forward to say they had seen Susan or Alex outside that home again. The absence of evidence wasn't just strange, it was glaring. Beckley was a small town, and word spread fast. The disappearance shocked the community. Susan was described as responsible, hard-working, devoted to her daughter. Mark was 10 years old, too young to survive alone, too attached to her mother to vanish without her. When both of them dropped out of sight, people who knew the family grew suspicious. Conversations in the neighborhood circled around one fact. Susan was not the type of person to simply vanish. If she and Alex were gone, something had gone terribly wrong. The police began pressing Webb harder. He repeated the same line that Susan and Alex had left on their own. But investigators couldn't reconcile his story with the evidence. No suitcases were missing. No bank accounts were touched. Susan's car was still parked at the house. The more police looked, the more Webb's story unraveled. The investigation revealed mounting red flags. Webb had a reputation for temper and arguments. Neighbors had overheard heated disputes between him and Susan in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Money was a constant point of tension. Witnesses recalled Susan complaining about financial struggles in the household. These details suggested the atmosphere in the home was far from stable. Still, without hard evidence, police had little more than suspicion. Days stretched into months. Susan's employer confirmed she had never returned to work. Friends stopped receiving calls. Alex's teachers noted her permanent absence. The daily lives of both mother and daughter had come to a complete halt. Every trail investigators followed led back to the same place, the Beckley house, owned by Larry Webb. But without proof, Webb remained a person of interest, not yet a defendant. The community, meanwhile, was restless. Vigils were held. Flyers were printed with Susan and Alex's photos. Volunteers searched wooded areas around town. Each passing day without news deepened the mystery. Police looked closely at Webb's statements. If Susan and Alex had indeed left suddenly, why had no one seen them? Why had Susan left her car behind? Why were Alex's belongings still in her room? The story didn't add up. Investigators grew convinced Webb was lying. But with no bodies, no physical evidence, they could not move forward with charges. For Susan's family, the weight was unbearable. Rick Lafferty begged for answers, insisting something violent had happened inside Webb's home. Susan's relatives agreed. They said Susan would never take her daughter away without at least contacting someone. Every sign pointed inward, not outward. They believed Webb knew the truth. They believed the answers were hidden behind his walls. By the end of 2000, Susan and Alex's disappearance had shifted from a case of missing persons to a presumed double homicide. But still, there were no bodies, no confessions, and no breakthroughs. Webb continued living in Beckley, denying involvement. The house where Susan and Alex were last seen remained the central focus of suspicion, yet it produced no results that year. As the months passed, the mystery deepened. Susan and Alex were nowhere to be found. Webb's story grew thinner with every retelling, but he refused to change it. Law enforcement remained trapped in a cycle of suspicion without closure. For the community of Beckley and for Susan's family, the nightmare had only just begun. What made this disappearance so haunting was its setting. Susan and Alex vanished not on a cross-country trip, not during a late-night drive on a deserted road, but in broad daylight, in their own hometown, from the house where they lived. That fact amplified the shock. If a mother and daughter could vanish under those circumstances, then it could happen anywhere, to anyone. By the end of Part 3, the unanswered question loomed large. In August of 2000, the disappearance of Susan Carter and her 10-year-old daughter, Natasha Alex Carter, was officially reported. The Beckley Police Department opened a missing persons file, knowing immediately that this was not an ordinary case. Susan had no history of leaving without notice. Alex was a child deeply tied to her school, her friends, and her father, Rick Lafferty. Both vanished the same day, with no warning and no trace. That detail alone alarmed investigators. When a mother and daughter disappear together, it is rarely voluntary. The first and most obvious step was to question the man they had been living with, Larry Webb. Webb was Susan's boyfriend, and he had been sharing a home with the two for months leading up to August 2000. Police asked him directly, where were Susan and Alex? Webb claimed that the two had left suddenly, deciding to go off on their own. He said they hadn't told him where they were going, and he suggested they might have gone to stay with family or friends. At first it might have sounded plausible, but investigators quickly realized his story did not match the evidence, or more precisely, the lack of it. Susan's car was still in the driveway. Her clothes, her personal belongings, even her purse were all left behind. Forensic checks of her bank accounts and financial activity showed nothing after August 8, 2000. Alex never returned to school. There were no phone calls, no sightings, no digital trail. Police noted the contradictions. If Susan had truly chosen to leave, she would have taken essentials, clothes, identification, money, or at least her car. Alex, only 10 years old, had no ability to disappear on her own. The situation pointed to something darker. Very early on, Webb became the central figure in the investigation. Neighbors confirmed that Susan and Alex were last seen at the house they shared with him. None recalled seeing them leave. For years, the disappearance of Susan and Alex remained a haunting mystery in Beckley. Their faces appeared on missing posters, their names echoed in local news, but leads dried up. Every few months, police would follow a tip, someone claiming to have seen a woman and child who looked like them, somewhere out of state. Each tip was checked. Each tip led nowhere. Rick Lafferty, Alex's father, never gave up. He contacted police repeatedly, urging them to keep the case open. He spoke to media outlets, reminding the public that his daughter was still missing. But time passed. Seasons changed. What was once an urgent search became a cold case. For more than 2 decades, the Carter file collected dust. Then, in 2022, everything shifted. Acting on a renewed push to re-examine cold cases, investigators returned to the home that Larry Webb had occupied in Beckley. Webb still lived there, more than 20 years after Susan and Alex vanished. With a search warrant in hand, detectives combed through the property. This time, they looked closer, with updated forensic tools and a determination to uncover anything they had missed the first time. In a bedroom, the same room once used by young Alex, detectives found something embedded in the wall. It was the wall. It was a bullet lodged deep into the plaster. On its own, a bullet in a wall might not raise alarm. But when forensic technicians examined it, they made a chilling discovery. The bullet carried traces of blood. Advanced DNA testing confirmed what investigators feared. The blood belonged to Natasha Alex Carter. After 22 years, police had their first piece of physical evidence linking Webb to the disappearance. The bullet was not just a clue. It was proof of violence inside the home. The discovery broke the case wide open. In 2023, based on the DNA evidence and testimony from, he told officials that he had argued with Susan about missing money. In a fit of rage, he killed her. Realizing what he had done and terrified that Alex would expose him, he turned on the child. He admitted that he murdered Alex to cover up the first crime. He explained how he wrapped their bodies in blankets, hid them temporarily in the basement, and then buried them in his backyard. It was the kind of confession investigators dream of and dread at the same time. The truth, finally spoken, but only after decades of denial, and only when the suspect had nothing left to lose. 6 hours after Webb's death, officers acted quickly. They searched his property once more, focusing on the backyard. Beneath the soil, exactly where he said, they uncovered human remains. The bones of Susan Carter and her daughter, Natasha Alex Carter, were finally found. The discovery closed the mystery that had haunted Beckley for 24 years. The missing persons case officially became a homicide case with both confession and physical evidence to support it. For the Carter family, the moment was bittersweet. Rick Lafferty expressed it best when he told reporters, "It's kind of a sad day, but also a happy day because I can bring my baby home." After decades of waiting, he finally had answers. But the answers came too late for justice in a courtroom. Webb was gone, beyond the reach of sentencing. The law could not punish him. The investigation of Susan and Alex Carter stands as a striking example of persistence. It shows the limitations of the justice system when evidence is scarce, and the power of forensic science to breathe life into cases once thought unsolvable. It also shows the cruelty of time. For years, Webb lived freely, while Susan and Alex lay buried in his backyard. For years, a father searched, while the truth was hidden in plain sight. The case is now closed, but the story continues to echo far beyond Beckley. It reminds us, in October of 2023, after more than 2 decades of unanswered questions, prosecutors in West Virginia finally moved forward against the man who had lived with Susan Carter and her 10-year-old daughter Alex on the day they vanished. That man was Larry Webb. A Raleigh County grand jury indicted him on charges of first-degree murder in connection with Alex's disappearance. The indictment marked the first formal acknowledgement by the justice system that Webb was not just a witness, not just a man with conflicting stories, but the prime suspect, believed to have killed at least one of the victims. But the trial that many had waited decades to see never happened. At the time of the indictment, Webb's health was already failing. He suffered from a series of medical conditions that required hospitalizations and constant monitoring. His attorneys filed delay after delay, citing his inability to withstand a full jury trial. The community watched with frustration. For years they had heard rumors, seen law enforcement comb Webb's property, and suspected he knew far more than he ever admitted. Now, when the charges were finally brought, it seemed his health might prevent justice from ever being seen inside a courtroom. For months, Webb remained in custody, technically awaiting trial, but in reality shielded by his physical condition. Every scheduled date was postponed. The courthouse never heard the testimony, never saw the evidence laid out before a jury. Then, in April 2024, the case took a dramatic and irreversible turn. Webb's condition deteriorated sharply. Confined to a hospital bed, weak and aware that the end was near, he did something he had avoided for nearly a quarter of a century. He confessed. According to investigators, Webb told officers and medical staff that he had killed Susan during a heated argument over money missing from the home. He claimed the fight escalated, and in a violent outburst he ended her life. But the horror did not stop there. Webb admitted that after killing Susan, for the first time, Webb's guilt was no longer just a suspicion or a matter of circumstantial evidence. It came from his own mouth. His words, though spoken on his deathbed, matched the fragments of evidence police had collected over the years. Investigators did not wait. Just hours after Webb died, teams moved in on his former property. For years, searches of the home and yard had produced frustratingly little. But this time, guided by his confession, police knew exactly where to dig. Within hours, they found human remains buried beneath layers of soil in the backyard. The bodies, wrapped in old blankets, were consistent with Webb's description. Forensic teams worked carefully, recovering bones and personal effects. DNA testing soon confirmed what many feared and expected. The remains belonged to Susan Carter and her daughter, Natasha Alex Carter. The discovery ended 24 years of uncertainty, 2 decades of questions about whether Susan and Alex might still be alive, whether they had run away, whether someone else had taken them, were finally answered. Law enforcement officials stood before the press and made a grim declaration. The case was now closed. The confession, coupled with the recovery of the remains, resolved the investigation beyond reasonable doubt. If Webb had lived, they said, he would have faced life in prison with no chance of parole. Instead, he died as the only man who knew the full details of what happened inside that Beckley home on August 8, 2000. For Susan's family, and especially for Alex's father, Rick Lafferty, the news was almost unbearable. He had fought for years to keep attention on the case, to remind the public that his daughter and her mother deserved answers. When reporters asked for his reaction, his words captured the weight of the moment. "It's kind of a sad day, but also a happy day because I can bring my baby home." The sadness was in Beckley, the community that had lived with whispers and suspicion for decades. The news spread quickly. Local churches organized a small vigil. Neighbors gathered with candles and photographs of Susan and Alex. They spoke about the years of mystery, the pain of not knowing, and the relief that the truth, however awful, was finally in the open. For law enforcement, the case became a study in persistence. Back in 2022, during one of the many searches of Webb's home, investigators had found a bullet lodged in the wall of Alex's bedroom. Forensic testing revealed traces of blood. DNA confirmed it belonged to Alex Carter. That bullet was the breakthrough that allowed prosecutors to indict Webb the following year. But even with that evidence, the absence of bodies had always been a major obstacle. Now, with the remains unearthed, there was no longer any doubt. Officials acknowledged publicly that the delay in justice had been devastating for the family. They emphasized that if Webb had not confessed, the case might have dragged on indefinitely, with the remains hidden just a few feet beneath the soil. The legal closure was clear. Prosecutors announced that the case was resolved beyond reasonable doubt. The phrase carried weight. It meant there would be no further trial, no open question in the courts. The Carter case was officially over. But for the family and community, closure was far more complicated. At the vigil, one neighbor told reporters, "We've waited years for this. We always suspected Webb, but not knowing, it eats at you. Now we know, but it doesn't make it any less heartbreaking." Others pointed to the length of time it had taken, 2 decades in which Rick Lafferty pleaded for renewed investigations, in which Webb lived freely, in which Susan and Alex's remains lay buried in a yard while life went on around them. Even among law enforcement, there was recognition. The community of Beckley marked the moment with quiet respect. The case had haunted them for so long that its resolution felt like the end of an era. Teachers who had once known Alex, neighbors who had once seen Susan walking through town, all reflected on how much time had passed. 2 lives stolen in 2000, 2 decades of silence, and finally the grim truth uncovered in 2024. The Carter case is now remembered not only for its tragedy, but also for its endurance. It stood as one of West Virginia's longest unsolved mysteries, until a dying man's words and a final search brought the truth to light. And yet, even as officials declared the case closed, a larger question lingered. What does closure really mean? The confession was clear. The evidence was undeniable. The remains were recovered. Legally, the case was complete. But emotionally, for those who loved Susan and Alex, the loss remained as sharp as ever. The story of Susan and Alex Carter ended in a backyard grave. The man responsible never faced a jury, never heard a sentence read aloud in court. But the truth is no longer hidden. It is written in the forensic reports, in the confession, and in the sorrow of a father who finally knows where his child rests. The legal fallout is simple. Webb is guilty, the case is closed, the evidence is irrefutable. The final closure is far more complex. It is the silence left behind, the missing years, and the permanent reminder that sometimes justice arrives too late to heal the wounds it was meant to close. When the remains of Susan Carter and her 10-year-old daughter Natasha, Alex Carter, were uncovered in April 2024, the story that had haunted Beckley, West Virginia for more than 2 decades erupted across the nation. For years, the disappearance of Susan and Alex was a cold. Within hours of the discovery, national outlets were carrying the story. AP News broke the first wave of coverage, quickly followed by CNN, The Guardian, People, The Independent, and local stations like WSAZ. The headlines were blunt and gripping. 24-year mystery finally solved. Confession from the grave ends Carter case. Bodies found after 2 decades in Webb's backyard. The story was replayed across morning talk shows, evening news, and late-night commentary. True crime podcasts that had once featured the Carter case released emergency episodes, re-examining old details in light of the shocking confession. National legal analysts dissected the timeline. The initial investigation in 2000, the lack of evidence, the cold case status, the breakthrough bullet found in 2022, and finally, Webb's dying words that confirmed what many had long suspected. Producers of long-running crime shows contacted the Beckley Police Department, hoping to build documentaries around the case. Some emphasized the forensic side, the recovered bullet, the DNA analysis, the patient persistence of investigators. Others focused on the human story, a father waiting for 24 years to bring his daughter home. The sudden flood of coverage gave the Carter case a visibility it had never had before. For many Americans, it was the first time hearing about Susan and Alex. For the people of Beckley, it was a reminder that their quiet town now carried a story broadcast to millions. Locally, the shock was intense. Residents of Beckley learned that the very property where Webb had lived, and where he carried on his daily routines for decades, was the final resting place of Susan and Alex. One neighbor told reporters, "We walked past that house every single day. For more than 20 years, we cut the grass, drove to work, waved at Webb, and the whole time For Rick Lafferty, Alex's father, the discovery was the end of a long wait. He had fought for years to keep the case alive, to push investigators to keep looking, to believe that his daughter's story mattered. Standing before cameras in April 2024, Rick spoke words that spread quickly across the country. "It's kind of a sad day, but also a happy day because I can bring my baby home." That statement captured everything. The grief of final confirmation, the relief of closure, the knowledge that his daughter would not remain lost forever. Reporters replayed his words again and again. Commentators noted the mixture of sorrow and gratitude, the acknowledgement that even in tragedy, truth had a kind of value. For many viewers, Rick's statement personalized the case. It wasn't just about forensic evidence or court proceedings. It was about a father who had lived half his life with unanswered questions, now finally able to lay his daughter to rest. Beckley itself responded with vigils. Within days of the discovery, residents gathered in church halls and community centers, holding candles, photos, and white balloons. At one gathering, hundreds of people stood quietly in the evening light as Susan and Alex's names were read aloud. Friends and neighbors shared memories. Susan as a kind woman who worked hard to raise her daughter. Alex as a cheerful 10-year-old who loved school and was always seen hand in hand with her mother. The vigils weren't just about grief, they were about solidarity. For 24 years, the case had cast a shadow over Beckley. Now, even though the truth was painful, people felt a responsibility to honor Susan and Alex to mark the end of the silence. One community leader put it simply, "This isn't closure for us, but it is a chance to finally stand together and say we did not forget them." The vigils also attracted people from nearby towns. Strangers who had followed the case from afar drove hours to join. The Carter case quickly became a talking point for advocacy groups. Organizations dedicated to protecting women and children highlighted the lessons. The importance of investigating domestic disputes thoroughly, the dangers of overlooking patterns of violence, and the need for accountability when systems fail to act. Legal experts weighed in on national broadcasts. One attorney said, "This case shows how crucial it is to treat missing persons reports seriously from the start. If action had been taken more aggressively in 2000, maybe Webb would have been confronted earlier. Maybe Susan and Alex could have been found before decades passed." Others pointed out the broader issue of domestic violence. Susan had lived with Webb despite reported tensions over money and daily life. The case highlighted how victims trapped in volatile relationships can face lethal danger, and how law enforcement often struggles to intervene before it's too late. Advocacy groups launched campaigns using Susan and Alex's names, aiming to strengthen protective measures and raise awareness. Social media hashtags like #JusticeForSusan and Alex and #NeverForgetBeckley gained traction, amplifying discussions about reform. The case even sparked legislative talk in West Virginia. Lawmakers began discussing new policies for how long-term missing persons cases are reviewed, and whether backyards and private properties should be more aggressively searched when foul play is suspected. By mid-2024, the Carter case had become a fixture in the true crime landscape. Networks aired full specials reconstructing the 24-year timeline. Archival footage from the year 2000 played alongside recent images of investigators in Webb's backyard. The story was framed as a cautionary tale. How cases can stall without physical evidence, how forensic science eventually provides answers, and how persistence, combined with luck, can unearth the truth even decades later. Some shows emphasized the forensic angle, replaying how the bullet with Alex's blood became the turning point. The confirmation came through forensic testing. The remains, recovered from Webb's backyard, were examined and identified as belonging to Susan Carter and her daughter, Alex. The announcement ended decades of speculation. No longer were Susan and Alex simply missing. They were victims of murder, silenced and hidden in the very ground where Webb lived his life. For law enforcement, the recovery was validation of years of work. Detectives who had inherited the cold case spoke about the relentless drive to bring truth forward, no matter how long it took. For the family, it was the moment they had both dreaded and prayed for, proof that could finally put their loved ones to rest. With Webb's death and confession, the case was formally closed. Prosecutors declared that had Webb lived, he would have faced life in prison without the possibility of parole. Instead, justice was delivered not in a courtroom, but through his final words and the evidence buried with the victims. The case file was marked as resolved beyond reasonable doubt. Yet everyone understood what that really meant. Justice had been delayed for nearly a quarter-century, and the only reason truth surfaced was because Webb himself chose to speak when his life was ending. For Rick Lafferty, Alex's father, the discovery was both devastating and relieving. For years he had insisted that Susan would never abandon her daughter, that Alex would never simply disappear. He was right. His voice, his persistence, his refusal to let the case fade into silence kept pressure on investigators. Standing before reporters, he expressed what few could put into words. "It's kind of a sad day, but also a happy day because I can bring my baby home." Those words captured the duality of closure in cases like this, relief and heartbreak finally arriving at the same time. In Beckley, the news spread quickly. The town had carried the weight of the Carter disappearance since 2000. Many residents still remembered the posters, the vigils, the unanswered questions. To learn that Susan and Alex had been hidden all along in Webb's backyard shook the community. Neighbors gathered for memorials, bringing candles, flowers, and photos. At one vigil, a longtime resident said, "We walked past that yard for 20 years. We had no idea." The words summed up the shock. That the truth had been literally buried in plain sight. The vigils became opportunities for healing. People spoke about Susan as a caring mother, and Alex as a bright young girl whose life was stolen. The ceremonies gave the community a way to grieve together, to finally acknowledge that the waiting was over, even if the pain remained. The Carter case also sparked difficult questions. Why had the backyard not been fully searched in 2000? Why did it take more than 20 years to find the bullet that carried Alex's DNA? Could Susan and Alex have been recovered sooner if the investigation had been more aggressive? For many, those questions will never have satisfying answers. Law enforcement acknowledged the challenges of missing persons cases from that era. In 2000, forensic technology was limited. Investigative practices were different. Without bodies, In the world of true crime, the Carter case now stands as a textbook example of a cold case solved through a mix of persistence, forensic evidence, and confession. It demonstrates the importance of re-examining old files, of returning to suspects long thought unreachable, of testing evidence with new technology. It also demonstrates the cruel reality. Sometimes justice comes only when the perpetrator has nothing left to lose. Webb's confession wasn't an act of remorse. It was a final move from a man facing death. But for investigators, for family, and for community, it was enough to unlock the truth. When asked how he felt, Rick's answer echoed across every article and broadcast. Sadness and relief intertwined. His daughter would never come home alive, but she would come home nonetheless. After 24 years, she would not remain lost. That simple statement became the emotional center of the story. It reminded everyone watching that behind every headline, every court document, every piece of evidence, there are real people waiting for answers. The Carter case is now closed. The bodies have been recovered. The confession has been made. The file is stamped, and the legal system considers it resolved. But for the family, for the community, and for everyone who followed this case, the story lingers. It lingers in the questions about what might have been done sooner. It lingers in the memory of a little girl's life cut short. It lingers in the knowledge that sometimes the truth can be buried for decades, literally in the ground beneath us, before it finally comes out. The disappearance and murder of Susan and Alex Carter is a reminder that justice can take decades, but persistence matters. Evidence matters. Family voices matter. Their story is no longer a mystery, but it remains a tragedy that should never be forgotten. If you want to see more true crime cases uncovered and examined in depth, don't forget to like this video, share it with others.